Bastogne, Belgium, December 1944. The coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. And in the middle of it all, surrounded by German forces, freezing, running out of ammunition and medical supplies, a group of American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division faced an impossible situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, cut off from reinforcements. The Germans had them surrounded on all sides. The enemy sent a formal surrender demand. The situation was hopeless. And the American commander's response was a single word: nuts. What happened next became one of the most legendary stands in military history. A battle where sheer defiance and courage overcame overwhelming odds. Where men who had every reason to give up instead chose to fight. Where a single division held a crucial town against an entire German army and changed the course of the war. This is the story of the siege of Bastogne. The story of how the 101st Airborne Division earned their nickname, the Battered Bastards of Bastogne. The story of one crazy night when everything hung in the balance, and a few thousand American soldiers faced 5,000 Germans in close-quarters combat that would determine the fate of the Battle of the Bulge. This isn't a story about perfect military strategy or technological superiority. This is a story about men pushed beyond their limits who refused to break. About leadership in the face of impossible odds. About the kind of courage that doesn't come from training manuals, but from something deeper and more fundamental. Let me take you back to December 1944, to the frozen forests of Belgium, to one of the most desperate and heroic stands in American military history. The situation: Bastogne surrounded. To understand what happened at Bastogne, you need to understand the broader context of the Battle of the Bulge. By December 1944, the Allies had been steadily pushing German forces back toward Germany since the D-Day landings in June. The war seemed to be winding down. Many Allied commanders believed Germany would collapse within weeks or months. Some soldiers were making bets about being home for Christmas. Then, on December 16, 1944, Germany launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by tanks and artillery, attacked a lightly defended sector of the Allied line. The goal was to split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. The attack caught the Allies completely by surprise. German forces punched through the American lines, creating a bulge in the Allied front, hence the name Battle of the Bulge. American units were overrun, surrounded, or forced into chaotic retreats. In the middle of this chaos was the town of Bastogne. It doesn't look like much on a map, just a small Belgian town with a few thousand residents. But Bastogne was strategically crucial because it sat at the intersection of 7 major roads. Control those roads, and you control movement throughout the Ardennes. The Germans needed Bastogne to continue their advance. The Allies needed to hold it to prevent the German offensive from succeeding. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units, was rushed to Bastogne to defend the town. They arrived on December 18th, just ahead of the German forces. These were elite troops, paratroopers trained for the most difficult operations. But they were also exhausted, having just come off the line after the brutal Operation Market Garden a few months earlier. And they arrived woefully unprepared for what they were about to face. They'd been pulled from rest areas so quickly that many didn't have winter clothing. They had limited ammunition. They had no artillery of their own at first. They'd been moved so fast they'd outpaced their heavy weapons. They were supposed to be a quick reinforcement until more substantial forces arrived. Instead, the 101st found themselves cut off. By December 20th, German forces had completely surrounded Bastogne. The encirclement wasn't just on paper. It was real. German units controlled all the roads leading into and out of town. Supplies couldn't get in. Reinforcements couldn't arrive. Wounded couldn't be evacuated. The 101st, along with other American units that had gathered in Bastogne, were completely isolated. They had about 18,000 men inside the encirclement. Sounds like a lot, but consider what they were facing. German forces surrounding Bastogne numbered somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 troops. The Americans were outnumbered roughly 3-1 overall, and in some sectors the disparity was even worse. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow covered everything. The men didn't have adequate winter gear. They were living in foxholes dug into frozen ground. Many developed frostbite. Some froze to death in their positions. Supplies were critically low. Ammunition was rationed. Artillery shells were counted carefully. Each shot had to matter because they might not have more. Medical supplies were running out, and wounded men were suffering without adequate morphine or bandages. Food was scarce. The men were on reduced rations, eating 1 meal a day if they were lucky. They were cold, hungry, exhausted, and surrounded by an enemy that had every advantage. And then the Germans sent a surrender demand. The surrender demand and the famous response. On December 22nd, 4 days into the siege, 2 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a formal surrender ultimatum from the German commander. The message was clear. The situation was hopeless for the Americans. They were surrounded. They had no supplies. They couldn't win. Continued resistance would only result in the total annihilation of the American force. The Germans promised to treat prisoners according to the rules of war if the Americans surrendered immediately. The ultimatum was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne. Major General Maxwell Taylor, the division's regular commander, had been away when the crisis started, leaving McAuliffe in charge. McAuliffe read the German surrender demand. His staff waited for his response. The situation really was desperate. The Germans weren't exaggerating. The 101st was surrounded low on everything and facing an enemy with overwhelming numerical and material superiority. McAuliffe's initial response was unprintable. His actual first words, according to witnesses, were, "Aw, nuts," or possibly something considerably more profane, depending on which account you believe. But when asked for a formal written response to the German ultimatum, McAuliffe decided to keep it simple. His entire reply consisted of one word: nuts. The German officers who received this response were confused. They didn't understand the American slang. Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered McAuliffe's response, had to explain that it meant go to hell and that the 101st had no intention of surrendering. The Germans returned to their lines, and both sides prepared for the battle to continue. McAuliffe's response became instant legend. Word spread quickly through American lines. Nuts, the perfect encapsulation of defiant American spirit in the face of impossible odds. Not a long speech about honor or duty, not a detailed military justification, just one word that told the Germans exactly what they could do with their surrender demand. Morale among the surrounded American forces soared. If their commander was confident enough to tell the Germans to go to hell, then maybe, just maybe, they could actually pull this off. But confidence alone doesn't win battles. The men of the 101st still had to hold Bastogne against continued German attacks, and one night in particular would test them to their absolute limits. The German assault, overwhelming force. After McAuliffe's refusal to surrender, the Germans intensified their efforts to take Bastogne by force. They couldn't afford to leave a major American force in their rear as they pushed west. They needed to eliminate the Bastogne garrison to secure their supply lines and continue the offensive. The Germans had significant advantages. They had more troops, more tanks, more artillery. They controlled the territory around Bastogne, giving them the ability to choose where and when to attack. But they also had problems. The weather that was making life miserable for the Americans was also grounding the German Luftwaffe. German supply lines were stretched thin, and taking a defended town requires more than just numerical superiority. It requires proper coordination, and the German forces around Bastogne weren't perfectly coordinated. Multiple German divisions were involved in the siege, each with their own commanders and objectives. Sometimes they worked together effectively. Other times their attacks were piecemeal, allowing the Americans to shift forces to meet each threat. The Americans, despite being surrounded and outnumbered, had some advantages too. They controlled the town itself, which provided some shelter from the weather and gave them interior lines. They could move forces from one threatened sector to another more quickly than the Germans could shift attack positions around the perimeter. They also had experienced, well-trained troops. The 101st Airborne wasn't some green unit seeing combat for the first time. These were veterans of D-Day, Operation Market Garden, and other major battles. They knew how to fight. They knew how to improvise. And they were led by competent, aggressive officers who weren't about to give up. But experience and training only go so far when you're freezing, starving, low on ammunition, and facing an enemy with overwhelming force. The night of December 23rd into December 24th, Christmas Eve, saw one of the most intense German assaults of the entire siege. This was the night when approximately 5,000 German troops, supported by tanks and artillery, launched a major attack against the American positions on the western edge of the Bastogne perimeter. The Germans had been probing American defenses for days, looking for weak points. They'd identified a sector held primarily by elements of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and Team O'Hara, a mixed force of tanks and infantry near the villages of Champs and Hemrul, just west of Bastogne. If the Germans could break through here, they could drive straight into Bastogne itself, splitting the American defense and potentially collapsing the entire position. The German plan was straightforward: mass their forces, hit the Americans hard in a concentrated attack, break through the line, and push into Bastogne before the Americans could react. On paper, it should have worked. The Germans had the numbers. They had armored support. They had artillery preparation. The American positions they were attacking were thinly held, with soldiers who'd been under constant pressure for days. But battles aren't won on paper. They're won by the men doing the fighting. And on that crazy Christmas Eve night, the men of the 101st Airborne showed why they're considered one of the finest military units in American history. The crazy night, battle in the snow, the attack began after dark. German artillery pounded American positions, trying to soften them up before the infantry assault. The Americans hunkered down in their foxholes, enduring the barrage with the stoic determination of men who'd been through this before. When the artillery lifted, the German infantry advanced. 5,000 men moving through the snow in the darkness, supported by tanks, heading straight for the American lines. The Americans held their fire until the Germans were close. Ammunition was too precious to waste on long-range shooting. They waited until they could see the shapes of German soldiers moving through the darkness, until they couldn't miss. Then they opened fire. Rifles, machine guns, and the few pieces of artillery the Americans had available erupted. The night lit up with muzzle flashes and tracers. The sound was deafening. Continuous gunfire punctuated by explosions as artillery shells and grenades detonated. The Germans kept coming. They had the numbers to absorb casualties and keep pushing. Waves of infantry supported by tanks pressed against the American positions. In some places, they broke through the initial defensive line. German soldiers penetrated into American positions, leading to close-quarters fighting in the darkness. This wasn't the clean, organized combat you see in movies. This was chaos. Men fighting in the dark, often unable to distinguish friend from enemy, except by the shouted passwords and the direction gunfire was coming from. Soldiers using whatever weapons they had, rifles, pistols, grenades, knives, even entrenching tools and bare hands when it came to that. The Americans fell back in some areas, not in retreat, but in tactical withdrawals to better positions. Officers and sergeants moved through the madness, rallying their men, directing fire, plugging gaps in the line with whatever troops were available. One of the heroes of that night was Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. His positions were hit by a massive German assault. His men were being overrun. Rather than pull back completely, Chapuis organized a counterattack. With a makeshift force of whoever was available, headquarters troops, cooks, clerks, anyone who could hold a rifle, Chapuis led a charge directly into the advancing Germans. It was desperate and probably insane from a tactical standpoint, but it worked. The sudden counterattack confused the Germans and disrupted their momentum long enough for the Americans to stabilize their line. Another critical factor was American artillery. While the 101st had arrived at Bastogne without their own artillery, other units inside the perimeter had guns. These artillery crews worked throughout the night, firing mission after mission at German concentrations. They were dangerously low on shells. Each round was rationed carefully, but when it mattered most, they had just enough ammunition to break up German formations before they could overwhelm American infantry positions. The fighting went on for hours. Waves of German attacks met waves of American defensive fire. The snow turned red with blood. Bodies piled up in no man's land between the lines. Wounded men cried out in the darkness, some in English, some in German, many never to be reached by medics before they died from wounds or exposure. The Germans pressed hardest against the positions held by the 327th Glider Infantry near Champs. These soldiers held critical terrain. If the Germans took it, they'd have a direct path into Bastogne. The 327th fought with everything they had. When ammunition ran low, they fixed bayonets. When positions became untenable, they fell back to prepared secondary positions and kept fighting. Captain James Hatch, commanding a company in the 327th, later described the night as the longest of my life. His company started with about 100 men. By dawn, he had less than 40 still able to fight. But they held their position. Tank destroyers played a crucial role. The Americans had a limited number of these vehicles, essentially lightly armored vehicles with powerful anti-tank guns. When German tanks threatened to break through, these tank destroyers would engage them at close range. It was incredibly dangerous. German tanks outgunned and out-armored the American vehicles. But the American crews were skilled and brave, taking calculated risks to knock out German armor. One tank destroyer crew, after running out of armor-piercing ammunition, loaded high-explosive shells and continued engaging German infantry at point-blank range until their vehicle was disabled by enemy fire. The crew survived and fought on as infantry. As the night wore on, both sides were exhausted. The Germans had taken heavy casualties. Their attack had stalled. They'd failed to break through the American lines despite their numerical advantage and despite the Americans' desperate situation. As dawn approached on Christmas Eve morning, the German assault finally petered out. The last attackers withdrew back into the darkness, leaving the field covered in casualties. The Americans had held, barely, at tremendous cost, but they'd held. The aftermath of the night. As daylight broke on December 24th, the Americans in Bastogne could assess the situation. The German attack had been repulsed, but the cost had been severe. Casualties had been heavy. Ammunition reserves were critically low. Medical supplies were almost exhausted, and the aid stations were overwhelmed with wounded men. But they'd proven something crucial. The Germans couldn't take Bastogne by direct assault. The American defenses, though stretched thin, were too tough to crack. And then something remarkable happened. The weather cleared. For days, heavy cloud cover had blanketed the Ardennes, preventing Allied aircraft from flying. The Germans had taken full advantage of this to move forces and supplies without fear of air attack. But on Christmas Eve, the clouds parted. Blue sky appeared, and with it came the roar of Allied aircraft. C-47 transport planes, escorted by fighters, flew over Bastogne and began dropping supplies by parachute. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, everything the garrison desperately needed came floating down on multicolored parachutes. It was the best Christmas present the men could have imagined. The supply drops didn't end the siege, but they changed everything. Suddenly, the Americans weren't slowly running out of everything. They had ammunition to fight with. They had food to eat. They had bandages for the wounded. Morale, which had been sustained through sheer defiance despite the desperate situation, now had concrete reasons for optimism. The Allied air forces also began pounding German positions around Bastogne. Fighter bombers strafed and bombed German troops, tanks, and supply columns. The Germans, who'd been able to operate relatively freely while the weather was bad, now found themselves under constant air attack. The strategic situation was shifting. General George Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north toward Bastogne, trying to break through the German encirclement. The Germans now faced a race against time. They needed to take Bastogne before Patton arrived, or they'd find themselves caught between two American forces. On December 26th, elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines and linked up with the 101st Airborne in Bastogne. The siege was officially broken. Supplies could now arrive by road. Wounded could be evacuated. Reinforcements could come in. But the battle for Bastogne wasn't over. The Germans continued attacking, trying to cut the corridor Patton had opened. Fighting continued in and around Bastogne for weeks. The 101st remained in the line, continuing to fight despite their exhaustion and casualties. It wasn't until mid-January 1945 that the 101st Airborne was finally pulled out of the line and sent to a rest area. They'd been in continuous combat for a month. They'd suffered over 2,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. But they'd held Bastogne. They'd denied the Germans a crucial objective. They'd helped turn the Battle of the Bulge from a potential German breakthrough into a costly German defeat. Why it mattered. The Siege of Bastogne was more than just one battle in a larger campaign. It became a symbol of American resilience and courage. A symbol of what's possible when troops refuse to give up, even when the situation seems hopeless. Strategically, holding Bastogne was crucial to defeating the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans needed those roads to sustain their offensive. Without Bastogne, their supply situation became impossible. Their advance stalled, and once the Allied counteroffensive began, the Germans couldn't properly retreat because their logistics were a mess. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive of the war. It failed, and the failure cost Germany resources they couldn't replace. Tanks, troops, fuel, ammunition, all thrown into a desperate gamble that didn't pay off. After the Bulge, Germany was on a purely defensive footing, and the end of the war was just a matter of time. But beyond the strategic impact, Bastogne had a psychological impact. For the Americans and their allies, it proved that German forces could be stopped and beaten even when they had every advantage. For the Germans, it was demoralizing. They'd surrounded an American force, outnumbered them, cut them off, and still couldn't defeat them. The story of the 101st at Bastogne became instant legend. Nuts entered the American lexicon as the perfect expression of defiance. The battered bastards of Bastogne became a badge of honor. The Christmas Eve battle, when 5,000 Germans attacked and the Americans held against impossible odds, became the stuff of military legend. The men who made it happen. It's easy to talk about units and divisions and strategic objectives, but battles are won by individual soldiers making individual decisions in crucial moments. Let me tell you about some of the men who made the stand at Bastogne possible. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander, showed the kind of leadership that inspires men. His nuts response to the German surrender demand wasn't just quotable. It was exactly the tone his troops needed to hear. He could have responded with military jargon or diplomatic language. Instead, he gave a one-word answer that told everyone, from private to general, exactly where he stood. Throughout the siege, McAuliffe was everywhere, visiting units, checking positions, encouraging his men. He led from the front and shared the same dangers his soldiers faced. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis, who led that desperate counterattack on Christmas Eve with cooks and clerks, exemplified the kind of aggressive leadership that kept the American defense from crumbling. He didn't have textbook-perfect troops or ideal resources. He worked with what he had and made it enough. Colonel Robert Sink, commander of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, made famous decades later by the TV series Band of Brothers, held a crucial sector of the Bastogne perimeter. His regiment fought off repeated German attacks and maintained cohesion even when other units might have broken. Then there were the countless sergeants and junior officers whose names aren't in the history books, but who kept their small units together and fighting. The squad leader who held his position with 6 men when it should have been held by 30, the machine gunner who stayed at his weapon even after being wounded, the medic who ran into German fire to pull wounded men to safety. There were tank destroyer crews who engaged German tanks at suicidal ranges because that's what the situation required. Artillery crews who stayed at their guns during German attacks, firing over open sights at advancing infantry. Engineers who laid minefields and prepared demolitions under fire. And there were the ordinary infantrymen, the paratroopers and glidermen of the 101st, the attached units from other divisions, the stragglers and support troops who picked up rifles and joined the line. These men were cold, hungry, exhausted, and scared. But they did their jobs. They held their positions. They fought when fighting seemed pointless. They refused to give up when giving up would have been understandable. Many of them were very young, teenagers, or barely into their 20s. They'd been civilians a few years earlier. Now they were in frozen foxholes in Belgium, facing an enemy that wanted them dead, holding a position because someone needed to hold it. That kind of courage doesn't come from training, though training helps. It comes from something deeper, from a sense of duty, from loyalty to the men beside you, from pride in your unit, from a determination not to let others down even when you're terrified. The cost. We can celebrate the victory at Bastogne, but we shouldn't forget the cost. Over 2,000 Americans were casualties during the siege, killed, wounded, or missing. Each one of those numbers was a real person. Someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father, someone's husband, someone's friend. Many of the wounded suffered in conditions that were barely better than medieval. The aid stations were overwhelmed. Medical supplies ran out. Surgeons operated by candlelight in buildings with no heat. Men lay in frozen churches waiting for treatment that couldn't be provided. Some who would have survived with proper medical care died because the resources simply weren't available. The psychological cost was also severe. Combat stress, what we'd now call PTSD, affected many of the survivors. Men who held it together during the battle broke down afterward, once the immediate danger passed and they had time to process what they'd experienced and seen. The physical cost of simply surviving in those conditions was enormous. Frostbite was epidemic. Trench foot disabled hundreds. Exhaustion was universal. Even after the siege was lifted, many of the men were in no condition to continue fighting, though many did anyway because they were still needed. And we should remember the Belgian civilians caught in the middle of this battle. Bastogne was a functioning town with thousands of residents when the battle started. These people had their homes turned into battlefields. They sheltered in cellars while shells fell and bullets flew. They shared their meager food with the American soldiers. They tended wounded men. Some were killed in the crossfire. Their town was devastated. Victory came at a tremendous price. It's important to remember that while we celebrate the courage and sacrifice that won the battle, lessons and legacy, the Siege of Bastogne offers lessons that extend beyond military history. It's a story about what's possible when people refuse to accept that the situation is hopeless. The Americans at Bastogne had every rational reason to surrender. They were outnumbered. They were surrounded. They were low on everything. The weather was awful. Relief was uncertain. By any objective analysis, their position was untenable, but they didn't surrender. They fought, and they won. Not because they had better weapons or superior numbers or perfect strategy. They won because they refused to lose. That kind of determination is rare and precious. It's the difference between units that collapse under pressure and units that somehow find a way to hold. It's leadership that inspires rather than just commands. It's individual soldiers making the choice over and over to keep fighting when stopping would be so much easier. The story of Bastogne has been told and retold for 80 years now. It's been featured in books, movies, documentaries, TV shows. It's taught at military academies as an example of defensive operations under adverse conditions. The 101st Airborne Division still proudly claims Bastogne as one of their battle honors. But more than the tactical lessons or the historical significance, Bastogne represents something fundamental about human courage. About standing fast when everything tells you to run. About keeping faith with your comrades even when all seems lost. About leadership that says nuts to impossible odds. That Christmas Eve night when 5,000 Germans attacked and a few thousand exhausted, freezing, ammunition-depleted Americans held them off wasn't won by superior firepower. It was won by superior spirit, by men who'd been pushed beyond what should be the breaking point and simply refused to break. Conclusion. The story of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne is one of the great tales of military courage in American history. It ranks alongside the Alamo, Gettysburg, Belleau Wood, and other battles where Americans faced overwhelming odds and fought with extraordinary valor. But unlike some of those other famous last stands, Bastogne didn't end in heroic defeat. The men of the 101st lived to tell their story. They held their ground, relief arrived, and they survived to fight again. The crazy night when the 101st fought 5,000 Germans wasn't the whole story of Bastogne, but it was a crucial moment. It was the night when the German attempt to take the town by direct assault was decisively repulsed. It was the night when, if the American line had broken, the entire Bastogne defense might have collapsed. But the line held, the Germans fell back, and the next morning brought clear skies, supply drops, and the beginning of the end of the siege. 80 years later, we can look back on that night and marvel at what those men accomplished, freezing in foxholes, running out of ammunition, facing an enemy with every advantage, and still fighting, still holding, still refusing to surrender. When someone tells you something is impossible, remember Bastogne. Remember McAuliffe saying, "Nuts." Remember the men of the 101st Airborne holding a frozen town against an entire German army. Remember that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory isn't resources or strategy, it's the refusal to accept defeat. The 101st Airborne fought 5,000 Germans that crazy Christmas Eve night, and they won. Not because winning was easy or likely or even particularly rational given the circumstances. They won because they refused to lose. That's the lesson of Bastogne. That's why we still tell the story 80 years later. And that's why, as long as there are people who need to hear that courage and determination can overcome impossible odds, the story of the battered bastards of Bastogne will continue to be told.